As a pastor, I've dealt a fair amount with death. I have held the hands of people as they have died. I have had the honor of closing people's eyes after they've died. The way that death works today is that there's usually time to grieve between a death and a burial. Oftentimes, families are waiting for a funeral home to do its work. They're waiting for their families to gather together. And so, between the death and the burial, there is time to deal with things, at least to start with emotionally. That was not the way it was back in Jesus' day. We are afforded that time in between because of things like refrigeration. But in Jesus' day, they didn't have that. The day that someone died is usually the day that they were buried. Every once in a while, there would be some exceptions, but in Jesus' day and culture, it was very normal. You died, you were buried that day. And this week, we're going to hear about Jesus dealing with one of those deaths. From Luke chapter 7. Soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a large crowd from the town was with her. Jesus knew grief. God had been grieving since the dawn of time when the first sin happened with Adam and Eve. God knew what it was to hurt. And Jesus came into this broken world to die, to set us free from death. Now we get to see an example of Jesus dealing with death on this very sudden hurt. This young man was young, which means that either he had been suffering from a disease for a while, or more likely it was an accident of some kind. The mother had already lost her husband. There were no other sons, and she was alone, and this was sudden. Can you imagine that sudden turnaround from this morning I had a son, and now I'm burying him by the time the sun goes down? But Jesus is going to wade into this grief with this woman and love her dearly. And I want you to realize that too, that Jesus knows your grief, and he walks with you in that grief. And we'll see what Jesus does about that grief.